Chapter 14. Merlino the Miraculous was really the Duke in disguise. He had planned a joke against Don Quixote, and had carefully prepared his servants to carry it out. In the morning he sent them to fetch an old rocking horse from the attic, and covered it with a velvet curtain. Then they went out of sight and waited until they were needed. The Duke and Duchess fetched Don Quixote and Sancho Panza and led them out into the courtyard. "Here, most brave knight, is your magic horse. Because you will fly so high above the earth, you must be blindfolded, or you will fall in sheer terror." The Duke carefully tied a silk scarf around Don Quixote's eyes and then approached Sancho. "No, no," said the squire, "you'll not get me on that beast to be taken off of firm ground. If we'd been meant to fly, we would have feathers growing out of our arms." "This is the surest way to win your island," said the Duke. "You may well find one falls into your hand soon after you land." He said this because he and the Duchess had planned a joke at Sancho's expense for the next day. "Oh, well, the longer you look at it, the less you'll like it," Sancho said, and allowed his eyes to be blindfolded. The Duke helped them both to mount the rocking horse, Don Quixote in front and Sancho holding tightly on to him. "Here are the reins," the Duke said. "This magic horse will need no guiding, for it knows where to go. Just hold on tight and don't be tempted to look. If you do, you may fall, or may be blinded by the sun, for you will be very close to it. Good luck." The Duke trod firmly on the rocker, and Sancho cried out as the horse began to tilt to and fro. The Duchess called out in a very quiet voice, "Look how fast they go! They're so high already." The Duke signaled to his servants. Some came out with all the bellows from the blacksmith's forge and pumped air at the travelers, while others sprayed water at them from a watering can. "Hold tight," called Don Quixote. "We are passing through the clouds, and great winds are blowing." Sancho made no reply, but just moaned. More servants brought flaming torches and held them close to the traveler's face. "Do you feel the heat of the sun?" called out Don Quixote. But Sancho just cried out all the more in great terror. The Duke rocked the horse violently and then set light to its tail. He ran for shelter as the flames spread upwards. Suddenly there was a succession of great bangs as the flames reached the fireworks that had been placed inside the horse. The two riders were thrown off and fell to the ground. They lay there, afraid to move for a moment for fear that they would fall off whatever they had landed on and tumble all the way down to earth. Nothing happened, so after a few minutes Don Quixote took off his blindfold and looked around him. He was surprised to see that he was back in the courtyard they had started from. Apart from the moaning Sancho Panza, it was quite deserted. Standing where the horse had been was a notice which read, "As the fearless Don Quixote has ventured on so perilous a journey, what he most desires will be granted him as soon as his squire has willingly given himself 3,000 lashes." "Rejoice!" cried Don Quixote. "The beautiful Dulcinea del Toboso is as good as freed from enchantment." Sancho sat up, took off his blindfold, read the notice, groaned again, and lay down. "What's the matter?" asked Don Quixote. "You cannot surely begrudge so small a price." At that moment the Duke and Duchess came into the courtyard. They looked surprised at seeing the two travelers, and ran over to them. "Tell us of your journey," the Duchess said. "We were so worried. You have been gone for 3 days, and we had no news of you." 3 days, said Sancho. "It seemed to me more like 3 minutes. "That is the magic horse," said the Duke. "But tell us, did you look around on your journey?" "Yes, I lifted the corner of my blindfold and took one look down, said Sancho. I saw the world as small as an acorn far below, and my good wife waving up at me. Good Sancho, said the Duchess, hiding her smile. How could you see your wife if the world was as small as an acorn? That was the magic horse, said Sancho. Don Quixote now interrupted them. We must leave at once. We must travel to Toboso, and Sancho must lash himself along the way. There is no time to be lost. Come. The Duke and Duchess tried to persuade him to stay, for they had a plan to trick Sancho into believing he was governor of an island, so that they could be entertained by his folly. To every argument the knight just replied, I must serve my lady, and refused to stay. And so it was not long before they rode out of the palace, with the Duke and Duchess very sorry to see them go before they could play more tricks on them. Sancho was sorry to be leaving too, for he had eaten well and had not forgotten the Duke's promise of an island. As they went along, Don Quixote tried to make Sancho begin his lashes, and Sancho was busy inventing excuses to delay until nightfall, for he had a plan of his own. Chapter 15. The two travelers were so busy arguing about the lashes that they didn't notice they had come into a village until their way was blocked by a crowd of people standing across the road. They had obviously been shouting at each other because they were red in the face and plainly very cross. They had turned towards the travelers and were looking expectantly at Don Quixote. He pulled on Rocinante's reins to make him stop, not a difficult task at any time, and greeted them politely. You're just what we need, said a woman. These daft men can't decide anything. All they do is shout. At this, shouting did break out, mainly aimed at the woman, but Don Quixote raised his sword and said, I am the Knight of the Dismal Face, and I am pledged to defend all ladies, so beware. Let her speak. When everyone had become quiet, he said to her, Gracious lady, tell me in what way I can help you. I will do anything that does not interfere with my mission to disenchant my lady, Dulcinea del Toboso. The woman was too worked up to bother listening to what Don Quixote was saying, or she might have dismissed him as a madman. Here is George, she said, pointing to a stout miller who must have weighed at least 20 stone. And here is Robert, pointing this time to a skinny carpenter who was small enough to work as a jockey. They have a wager that they will race 100 meters at equal weight. George claims that Robert must carry on his back 11 stone and an old iron to make it fair. And I say, broke in Robert, that this pile, and he pointed to a collection of plowshares and gates and pieces of chain, will break my back if I try to pick it up, let alone run with it. And I say, shouted George, that I win because he won't race. All those who had bet on the race started shouting again, and it looked as if a fight would break out. But then Sancho bellowed, I have the answer. They were so surprised that they became silent and looked at him. George must take 11 stone off his body. He has plenty of places where he's got spare flesh. He can choose which bits to cut off. Great shouts of laughter came from everyone, except George, who shook his fist at Sancho. Agreed, agreed, they shouted. He'll be the better man for losing a little bit. The villagers were so delighted with Sancho's idea that they insisted on his coming into the inn and drinking up the prize money, as there was to be no race. Don Quixote reluctantly followed and sat rather sulkily in a corner. He hoped that wine would make Sancho more prepared to lash himself willingly, so that the spell would be undone. So it was that he overheard 2 other travelers talking quietly on the other side of a screen, and what he heard made him angrier still. I beg you, Jerome, read another chapter of the second part of Don Quixote while we wait for dinner. I can't think why you want any more of that rubbish, said the second voice, presumably that of Jerome. How can anyone who read that marvelous first part be content with this drivel? The knight is just a fool, and his squire a greedy dolt. Don Quixote could sit no longer. He went round the screen and said, Sir, I am that fool you referred to, and I call you a liar. By this he meant that he would fight a duel with him. Jerome rose to his feet and bowed politely. Most brave and worthy knight, I in no way called you a fool. I was talking about this rubbishy book that some scribbler has tossed off in a drunken moment, pretending to be the worthy Cervantes, who has immortalized your exploits. And he handed Don Quixote the book he had in his hands. Our hero flicked through the pages, shouted with rage, and tossed the book onto the fire. Such lies and such rubbish, he said. How can the Alonso press let such garbage see the light of day? The first book about me was a true record of all that I suffered at the hands of the evil enchanter, but this makes me a joke. If Jerome was sorry to see his book burnt, he did not show it, but politely asked Don Quixote to sit at their table and dine with them. The knight glanced at Sancho, saw that he was very drunk, and agreed. There would be no lashes that night. It was a very miserable Sancho Panza who grumbled his way along the road the next day. Willingly, it said, and willingly it meant, and willingly I'm not. All lay loads on the willing horse, but this one won't drink. They became so heated in their argument that they lost their way, and night found them in a forest of birch trees. Don Quixote continued to plead in desperation. Sancho agreed to lash himself. But you must pay me for each lash, he said. 1 sheep for each lash. But that's 3,000 sheep, exclaimed Don Quixote in horror. That's a fortune. I have but 300 at most. 1 sheep for every 100 lashes. 1 for every 50, said Sancho, and after an hour of arguing, that is what they agreed upon. You must stay here with your back to me and count, Sancho said. If you watch, you will feel so sorry for me that you will lose count, and we might be 1 short or 1 too many, which would be worse. Sancho walked into the forest until he was out of sight. He took off his belt and started lashing the nearest tree trunk, yelling and groaning as he did so. When he became tired, he stopped and limped dramatically back to Don Quixote. "How many was that?" he asked in a low voice. There was no answer. Don Quixote was asleep against the tree trunk. Sancho grinned. There could be no argument about it. He had certainly now given himself 3,000 lashes, and willingly too. Dulcinea should be disenchanted, or as disenchanted as she could be. He too fell asleep, counting sheep. Chapter 16. Our 2 heroes were still fast asleep the next morning when a great shout woke them with a start. They scrambled uncertainly to their feet and opened their eyes with difficulty. There, a few meters away, was a knight dressed all in black. He had a white full moon painted on his black shield, and not just the moon, but the man in the moon as well, and a rather sad man in the moon, for the paint had dripped slightly, so he seemed to be crying. The knight's own face was hidden by his visor. "Hail to you, Don Quixote, the knight of the dismal face! I challenge you, I, the knight of the full moon, challenge you under the usual conditions. The loser must return home and quest no more." Don Quixote raised his sword and replied, "The last who challenged me thus, the Knight of the Mirrors, slunk home himself and rests there still. Beware, Knight of the Full Moon, for you have challenged the greatest knight of all Spain." "I am waiting," said the Knight of the Full Moon, backing his horse carefully and watching his opponent. He had no squire with him, but otherwise both he and his horse looked remarkably like the Knight of the Mirrors and his horse, except he seemed rather more careful and was holding on to his saddle horn very firmly. Sancho helped his master saddle up Rocinante and fasten his armor. He gave him a leg up and steadied him when he looked like he was falling off again. Then he patted Rocinante and went behind a tree to shelter. The two knights raised their lances and kicked their horses. Both animals trotted reluctantly forward, their riders bouncing up and down. Don Quixote swept his lance widely and wildly at the Knight of the Full Moon, lost his uncertain balance, and toppled slowly off Rocinante and clanged to the ground. Rocinante, with no weight on his back, trotted rather faster towards a patch of grass and stopped to graze. The Knight of the Full Moon dropped his lance, slid from his horse, and seized Don Quixote's sword. He put one foot on his chest and yelled, "Yield, Knight of the Dismal Face, for I have overcome you in a fair fight." Don Quixote lay bruised and broken-hearted. He had no choice. All his knightly code demanded that he yield and accept his victor's terms, and yet this would be the end of his life as a knight. To live as a knight meant not being a knight. "I yield," he said simply. "But, master, my island," protested Sancho Panza. "Your dreams must end with mine," said Don Quixote, "unless you serve this valiant knight as his squire." At this the Knight of the Full Moon, or Samson the Bachelor, as of course he really was, said quickly, "Alas, I have vowed that if only I were able to defeat the most worthy knight in all Spain, Don Quixote, I would give up knighting, and I would devote my life to study." "So it goes," said Sancho. "A chicken in the pot is worth a promised flock, for islands melt quickly enough when the rain falls," for tears were running down Don Quixote's face. "Farewell, great knight," said his vanquisher, and he turned his horse and rode off, for he wished to be safely home before the others returned, so that Don Quixote would not realize how he had been tricked. "Master, I completed the lashes last night," said Sancho, partly to cheer Don Quixote and partly to establish his claim to the sheep so that he should come out of the adventure with something. "Dulcinea will be disenchanted now, and she will know that it was your doing." Don Quixote said nothing, but climbed slowly onto Rocinante's back and set his face for home. As they went, rain started to fall heavily and lowered their spirits still further as it soaked through their clothes. Sancho tried to sort out in his own mind what had exactly happened and what had been trickery, but soon gave up and thought only of getting home. Don Quixote thought of the books that would be written ridiculing his quest and his ignoble ending. They splashed despondently along the road, wishing to be home and done with journeying. Chapter 17. Samson the Bachelor had warned Don Quixote's niece that her uncle was coming home, so when he arrived he found a warm welcome and no questions which would reopen the wounds to his pride. But the rough living and the soaking he had received on the 2 days of his journey home made him very ill. He was very feverish and tossed restlessly, talking in fragments about his adventures. His niece feared for his life, and feared for his sanity if he were to live. Don Quixote did recover from this fever, but it left him weak and suddenly old. As his body healed, his mind cleared, and he realized how deluded he had been. "How dangerous books are," he said to Father Thomas the priest. "Books should be burned on a great fire, so that people are not led astray by them." "It is not the books always," replied Father Thomas, "but our own weakness that makes us believe what we should take as entertainment for our winter's evening." "Let everyone learn from my example," said Don Quixote. "Do not trust writers, but look at the world with common sense and learn to see what is really there." "Amen to that," said Father Thomas. Don Quixote paid Sancho his sheep, and spent his days overseeing his farm and seeing to the well-being of the villagers. But he was never really well again, and soon slipped quietly into his last illness. His death brought great sadness to all his friends, for he was a kindly, honest man, whose only desire had been to do good in the world. Few of those who laughed at him did so little harm in the world, or were so well loved by those who knew them. The End.